Before the animosity, before the hostage crisis, before the proxy wars and nuclear standoffs, there was hope. A hope that the United States and Iran could be allies, perhaps even friends. At the dawn of the 20th century, while European empires carved up Asia and Africa, Iran, then known as Persia, stood on precarious ground. Britain and Russia dominated its economy and controlled its politics. Persia's rulers, the Qajars, were deeply indebted, and their country was crumbling under foreign influence. But in the distance, a new power was rising. The United States. Unlike the colonial giants, America had no empire in the Middle East, and that gave it something rare in the eyes of Iranians: credibility. When Iran's first ambassador to the US arrived in Washington in 1889, he was welcomed with warmth and ceremony. Iranians admired the US Constitution, American education, and its revolutionary history. They hoped the US would support Iran's own struggle against imperial domination. By 1906, Iranians launched their first constitutional revolution, a bold attempt to limit monarchical power and establish a parliament. And while Europe viewed Iran's democratic aspirations with skepticism, many Iranians looked across the Atlantic for inspiration. In 1911, Iran made a surprising move. It invited an American, Morgan Schuster, to take over its failing finances. Schuster arrived in Tehran and immediately began rooting out corruption, exposing British and Russian meddling, and defending Iranian sovereignty. It was revolutionary, but it didn't last. The Russians and British issued ultimatums, and under threat of invasion, Schuster was forced to resign. The message was clear: foreign powers would not tolerate Iranian independence. Yet, the goodwill toward the United States survived. Fast forward to 1941. With World War II raging, Britain and the Soviet Union invaded Iran to secure oil and supply lines. The Shah, Reza Shah Pahlavi, was exiled, and his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was placed on the throne. Iran, though officially neutral, became an occupied country. The US, now emerging as a superpower, took a different approach. President Franklin D. Roosevelt assured Iran that America respected its sovereignty. In 1943, at the Tehran Conference, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Iran. Roosevelt promised Iran economic assistance and post-war support. For a moment, Iranians believed the Americans might be different from the imperialists of the past. Then came the pivotal moment. Prime Minister Mossadegh. In 1951, Mossadegh, a secular nationalist and fierce defender of Iranian sovereignty, was elected by the parliament and quickly became a symbol of pride. His boldest move? Nationalizing Iran's oil industry, which had been controlled by the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, now known as BP. To Iranians, it was a matter of dignity. Their oil, their lifeblood, had enriched Britain for decades, while most Iranians lived in poverty. Mossadegh declared, "We are not against the British, but we will not let them rule our country and plunder our resources." Britain retaliated with crippling sanctions and blockades, but Iran stood firm. The crisis escalated, and Britain turned to its closest ally, the United States. Initially, President Truman refused to interfere. He admired Mossadegh's democratic ideals. But in 1953, the winds shifted. Dwight D. Eisenhower became president, and the Cold War was in full swing. Fearing Iran might fall to communism, the CIA, along with British intelligence MI6, launched Operation Ajax. The goal? Remove Mossadegh and restore the Shah to absolute power. August 1953. The streets of Tehran echoed with chaos. Rumors swirled, fists flew, buildings burned, and within hours, Iranian democracy had been overthrown. But this wasn't the work of an uprising from within. It was the product of a foreign engineered deception, designed in Langley, Virginia. The code name, Operation Ajax. The goal, remove Prime Minister Mossadegh and preserve Western control of Iran's oil. The operation was orchestrated by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., a CIA officer and the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. Working closely with British intelligence, Roosevelt carried bags of cash into Tehran, paying off politicians, journalists, military officers, and street thugs. Propaganda was spread through Iranian newspapers, owned or infiltrated by the CIA. False headlines accused Mossadegh of being a communist sympathizer, anti-Islam, and mentally unstable. The narrative was simple. He was dangerous, and the Shah was the rightful savior. On August 15th, the first coup attempt failed. Mossadegh's forces arrested the Shah's men. The Shah panicked and fled to Baghdad, then to Rome. For a brief moment, it seemed the Iranian people had triumphed over imperialism. But that illusion didn't last long. On August 19th, the CIA doubled down. With the help of bribed generals and mobs posing as both pro- and anti-Mossadegh supporters, the capital descended into orchestrated chaos. Royalist soldiers stormed Mossadegh's home. The Prime Minister, who had once electrified the UN with his defiance, was dragged into custody. And just like that, the Shah returned. To the US and Britain, the mission was a success. Western oil interests were secured. The Shah was once again in power. The Cold War threat, real or imagined, was neutralized. But to most Iranians, it was a humiliation. Mossadegh wasn't just a prime minister. He was a symbol of national dignity. His downfall confirmed their worst fears. The West would never allow an independent Iran. The Shah, now ruling with unchecked authority, owed everything to Washington. And he made it clear. He aligned with US policies, bought American weapons, welcomed American oil companies, and allowed the CIA to train his secret police, the SAVAK. What made Operation Ajax more devastating than a military invasion was its subtlety. No American soldiers marched into Tehran. No bombs were dropped. Instead, the coup was carried out behind closed doors, with bribes, lies, and manipulation. This was a new form of imperialism, covert, strategic, and deniable. The US publicly denied involvement for decades, even as Iranian school children grew up learning the truth. By the time President Obama finally admitted American complicity in 2013, the damage had been done for 60 years. Ajax didn't just destroy a government, it created a time bomb. It radicalized Iranian political thought. It convinced clerics like Ayatollah Khomeini that America could not be trusted. It taught future revolutionaries that negotiation was futile and that only Islamic resistance could prevent foreign domination. In short, it transformed the United States from a potential partner in Iran's eyes to a villain etched into the national memory. When the revolution came in 1979, it wasn't just a reaction to the Shah's tyranny. It was a response to the foreign hand that had put him on the throne, a legacy of mistrust. For Americans, 1953 was a strategic win. For Iranians, it was a scar that never healed. It marked the beginning of a new kind of war, not fought with armies, but with ideology, economics, and propaganda. The coup was never just about oil, it was about power. And in taking it, the US lost something far more valuable: Iran's trust. In the glow of American victory, Iran's new old ruler returned. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the so-called King of Kings, ascended the peacock throne, not by popular will, but by CIA design. To Washington, he was the perfect ally. Westernized, anti-communist, oil-rich, and loyal. To Iranians, he was a monarch imposed by foreign hands, ruling from a golden cage, his throne propped up by American dollars and SAVAK guns. This was the beginning of an era marked by ambition, paranoia, and a widening chasm between ruler and ruled. Flush with oil wealth and foreign backing, the Shah launched a sweeping project of modernization known as the White Revolution. Not a revolution of blood, but one of concrete, steel, and control. Land reforms aimed to break up large feudal estates. Women were granted the right to vote. Education expanded. Literacy rose. Infrastructure boomed. Highways, factories, and skyscrapers dotted the skyline. But beneath the steel and progress, there was rot. The land reforms, in practice, displaced millions of rural farmers without providing economic stability. Urbanization created sprawling slums. Economic inequality widened. Traditional and religious leaders, especially the powerful clergy, felt alienated, ignored, and attacked. The Shah believed he was building a new Iran, but many Iranians saw it as an imposed westernization project, designed not to serve the people, but to please Washington. As opposition grew, so did fear. The Shah's answer: SAVAK, Iran's secret police, trained by the CIA and Israel's Mossad. Established in 1957, SAVAK became one of the most feared intelligence agencies in the Middle East. It censored the press. It infiltrated mosques, universities, and political movements. It arrested, tortured, and executed dissenters. Thousands were imprisoned. Some simply vanished. Even mild criticism of the monarchy could earn you a visit from SAVAK and a one-way ticket to Evin prison. The US, aware of these human rights abuses, said little. The Shah was their man. Iran was too important, too rich in oil, too useful in the Cold War. Democracy could wait. In the 1960s and 70s, Iran became a cash machine for the US military-industrial complex. Billions of dollars in oil revenues flowed from Tehran. In return, the Shah purchased vast quantities of American weapons, fighter jets, missiles, tanks. By the mid-70s, Iran had the fifth largest military in the world. American corporations flooded into Iran. General Motors, IBM, Westinghouse. US advisors were embedded in Iran's ministries. Tehran began to look like Dallas or Los Angeles on the surface. But for the average Iranian, prosperity remained a dream. The oil wealth flowed upward to the royal court, the elite, and foreign corporations. Worse, the Shah's arrogance grew. He celebrated 2,500 years of Persian monarchy in 1971 with a lavish, multi-million-dollar festival in Persepolis, while many Iranians struggled to eat. Caviar, champagne, and European royalty filled the desert tents, while ordinary Iranians watched from behind barbed wire. The disconnect was no longer just political. It was cosmic. As the Shah tightened his grip, opposition didn't disappear. It went underground. Among the most vocal critics was a cleric living in exile, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini had spoken out fiercely against the Shah's regime since the early 1960s, denouncing the White Revolution as anti-Islamic and accusing the Shah of selling out Iran to foreign interests. In 1963, Khomeini was arrested, causing widespread protests. By 1964, he was exiled, first to Turkey, then to Iraq. But exile only made him stronger. Tapes of his speeches were smuggled into Iran and distributed in bazaars, mosques, and universities. He became a myth, a voice in the shadows, a symbol of resistance. As student protests and worker strikes grew in the 1970s, many found themselves drawn not to Marxism or liberalism, but to Khomeini's vision of an Islamic government free from Western domination. The Shah's empire looked unshakable from the outside, but beneath the gold and glass, the ground was cracking. The youth were angry. The economy was overheating. Political dissent was boiling just beneath the surface. And the regime's dependence on the US made it vulnerable to shifts in perception. The more the Shah aligned with Washington, the more he seemed like a foreign-backed dictator. He ruled in a palace of mirrors, reflecting only what he wanted to see, until it was too late. The trap was set. The Shah had everything: money, weapons, global prestige. But he lacked the one thing a ruler needs to survive: the love and trust of his people. He ruled from a golden cage, decorated by American power, but surrounded by popular hatred. Every reform he imposed felt foreign. Every crackdown deepened resentment. Every dollar spent on US weapons felt like betrayal. And somewhere in exile, Khomeini was waiting for the right spark. By the late 1970s, Iran looked like a fortress, wealthy, militarized, and closely aligned with the world's superpower. But inside, it was crumbling. The Shah ruled with a diamond-studded fist, but he could no longer silence the growing roar from the streets. The people were no longer afraid, and the man they were listening to wasn't even in the country. His name was Ruhollah Khomeini, a scholar, a revolutionary, an exile, and soon, the undisputed voice of a nation on fire. The wave begins, Iran's boiling point. The signs of collapse began subtly. Inflation soared, unemployment rose, food prices climbed, even as oil profits filled royal coffers. Corruption was rampant, but what made the crisis existential was not just economic hardship, it was identity. To many Iranians, their culture, their values, their Islamic traditions were being sold off in favor of Western consumerism, greed, and decadence. The Shah wasn't just autocratic, he was seen as un-Iranian. Then, in January 1978, the regime made a mistake. A government-controlled newspaper published a defamatory article attacking Ayatollah Khomeini, calling him a British agent and a deviant cleric. The response was immediate and explosive. Students in the holy city of Qom rioted. Police opened fire. Several were killed, and thus began a cycle of protest, mourning, and repression that spiraled into something unstoppable. Every 40 days, a cycle of defiance. In Shia tradition, martyrs are mourned 40 days after death. So after the first killings, protests erupted again, 40 days later, and again after that, and again. Each cycle grew larger, angrier, and more coordinated. Universities, bazaars, oil workers, and clerics all joined. The Shah tried everything: arresting dissidents, declaring martial law, appointing a military government, promising reforms. But it was too late. The people no longer believed him. The regime was drowning. The voice in exile, Khomeini, speaks to a nation. From exile in Paris, Khomeini began sending cassette tapes back into Iran, smuggled inside books, under turbans, in suitcases. They spread like wildfire. Khomeini didn't just oppose the Shah, he rejected the entire system. He called for an Islamic government where laws would be based on the Quran and sovereignty would belong to the people through God's law. And most critically, he blamed America. He accused the US of propping up a dictator, exploiting Iran's oil, corrupting its culture, undermining its faith. To millions of Iranians, it made perfect sense. The CIA coup of 1953, the Shah's dependency on Washington, the weapons deals, the secret police, it all fit. The revolution wasn't just against the Shah, it was against everything he represented. By late 1978, Iran was in open rebellion. Oil strikes crippled the economy. Millions protested in the streets. The Shah, now battling lymphoma in secret, had lost the will to rule. On January 16, 1979, he and his wife boarded a plane and left Iran. He called it a vacation, but the people knew it was exile. They danced in the streets. 2 weeks later, on February 1st, The moment that would redefine the Middle East arrived. Ayatollah Khomeini returned. A plane touched down at Tehran's Mehrabad airport. A frail cleric stepped off the stairs and was greeted by a sea of millions. The exiled scholar was now the supreme leader of a revolution. From republic to theocracy, Khomeini didn't waste time. In March 1979, a national referendum was held. The question was simple: do you support the creation of an Islamic Republic? The result: over 98% said yes. The monarchy was gone. The Islamic Republic of Iran was born. And America had just lost its most important ally in the region. But the story wasn't over. The Shah was still alive, living in exile. And when the US agreed to admit him for cancer treatment later that year, it ignited a rage that would explode into one of the most humiliating events in US history. The revolution was just the beginning. The Islamic Revolution was not just a political upheaval, it was a spiritual earthquake. It redefined Iran. It redrew alliances. It declared that Islam could be a political force. And most importantly, it made America the enemy. The Shah's fall was just one chapter. The next would shake the world. And it would begin with the storming of the American embassy and 444 days of darkness. November 4th, 1979. A date that would burn itself into the minds of Americans.
Screeched to a halt in 1979 when the Islamic Revolution overthrows the Shah. 52 Americans taken hostage from our embassy in Tehran and held for 444 days.
At precisely 10:30 a.m., a group of young Iranian revolutionaries, armed with nothing more than chains, banners, and raw fury, stormed the gates of the US embassy in Tehran. Their mission was simple: seize the embassy, hold the diplomats, send a message to the world. Within hours, the American flag was torn down. 66 US citizens and diplomats were taken hostage, blindfolded, paraded before cameras. The most powerful country in the world had been humiliated on live television. And this was no temporary protest. It would last 444 days. Why did it happen? The deeper motive. At first glance, it seemed like an act of pure retaliation. But this wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It was a calculated strike at the heart of what Iran's new leaders saw as the real threat: American imperialism. Here's the spark. In October 1979, the US quietly admitted the Shah, now terminally ill, into America for medical treatment. To Washington, it was a humanitarian gesture. To Iran's revolutionaries, it was a provocation. They believed this was the first step in another US-backed coup, a replay of 1953. The students who stormed the embassy named themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line, and they issued a chilling demand: return the Shah to Iran for trial. Ayatollah Khomeini, who hadn't ordered the attack, quickly endorsed it. He called the embassy a nest of spies, and he used the moment to solidify power, crush internal opposition, and declare a new era of anti-American revolution. In the US, outrage erupted. The world's most powerful nation was being held hostage by students. President Jimmy Carter faced a crisis unlike any other. Daily images of blindfolded American hostages fueled anger and humiliation across the country. News anchors opened every broadcast with the same line: Day 27, Day 101, Day 212. America counted, one day at a time, through diplomatic stalemates, failed negotiations, and mounting national frustration. In April 1980, the US launched a daring military rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw. Helicopters flew into the Iranian desert under the cover of darkness, but the mission ended in catastrophe. 2 helicopters crashed. 8 American servicemen were killed. The operation failed before it even reached Tehran. For Iranians, it was a sign of divine protection. For Americans, it was a national embarrassment. For President Carter, it was political death. He would lose re-election just months later. His opponent, Ronald Reagan, campaigned on strength and retribution. As Iran sank into war with Iraq in 1980, the hostage crisis lost its revolutionary shine. The Islamic Republic needed to stabilize. Khomeini had made his point. Finally, through backdoor negotiations, primarily mediated by Algeria, an agreement was reached. The US agreed to unfreeze $8 billion in Iranian assets and promised non-intervention in Iran's future. On January 20th, 1981, minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president, the hostages were released. After 444 days in captivity, they came home. The hostage crisis didn't just end diplomacy, it annihilated it. No US embassy has reopened in Tehran since. Iran became officially designated a state sponsor of terrorism. Sanctions followed. Isolation deepened. And the American public developed a deep, enduring hatred of the Iranian regime. In Iran, the hostage crisis was hailed as a divine victory over imperialism. To this day, some still celebrate the anniversary as a national holiday. But in truth, both nations lost something permanent: trust, dialogue, the chance at a different future. From here on, only shadows. The US would never again see Iran as a potential ally. Iran would never again see America as anything but a threat. The events of those 444 days pushed both nations into a permanent state of hostility, suspicion, and proxy conflict, a pattern that continues to this very hour. The lines were drawn, the bridge was burned, and from the ashes of the embassy rose a rivalry that has haunted the world for 4 decades. The embers of revolution were still glowing in Iran. The Ayatollah had seized power. The Shah was gone, and the United States had been publicly humiliated for 444 days. But just when it seemed things couldn't escalate further, a new player stepped onto the chessboard: Saddam Hussein, the ruthless leader of neighboring Iraq. In 1980, he made a bold move. He invaded Iran. It was the beginning of an 8-year nightmare, a war that would kill over 1 million people, and a war where the United States, despite its moral outrage over the hostage crisis, chose to support a dictator who would gas civilians just to bleed Iran dry. The logic behind the bloodshed: Saddam believed Iran was weak, politically chaotic, militarily unprepared, and vulnerable. He feared that Khomeini's Islamic revolution might inspire Iraq's own Shia majority to rise up against his Sunni-dominated regime. So he struck first. On September 22nd, 1980, Iraqi planes bombed Iranian airfields. Ground troops poured across the border. Saddam's goal was clear: take control of the disputed Shatt al-Arab waterway, a key oil shipping route. Capture Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province. Crush the revolution before it spread. At first, Iraq made gains, but the Iranians, fueled by revolutionary zeal, fought back with fury. As the war dragged into 1981, 1982, and beyond, it became a horrifying stalemate. Human wave attacks by teenage Iranian volunteers charged into minefields. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Civilians became targets. And then, chemical weapons entered the battlefield. Saddam's forces used mustard gas and nerve agents against Iranian soldiers, and even against Iraqi Kurds in Halabja. The world watched, and so did the United States. Washington's quiet hand. Publicly, the US condemned the violence, but behind the scenes, it had made a cold, calculated decision. Better Saddam than Khomeini. So the US began providing Iraq with satellite imagery to help target Iranian positions, intelligence briefings on troop movements, dual-use technology, civilian tech that could be weaponized, and perhaps most shockingly, diplomatic cover at the United Nations to shield Iraq from consequences of chemical warfare. In 1983, Donald Rumsfeld, a former Secretary of Defense, even traveled to Baghdad to shake hands with Saddam, a moment immortalized in photographs. Why? Because in the eyes of Washington, containment of Iran's revolution was worth the moral compromise. The US didn't sell Saddam the gas, but it knew he was using it, and looked away. By the mid-1980s, the conflict spilled into the Persian Gulf. Iran began attacking oil tankers headed for Iraq. Iraq responded in kind. Soon, the US Navy entered the fray, escorting Kuwaiti oil tankers under the American flag. Clashes intensified, and in 1988, tragedy struck. The USS Vincennes, a US warship, shot down Iran Air Flight 655, a commercial passenger jet. 290 civilians died, including 66 children. The US claimed it was an accident, mistaken for a military jet. But for Iranians, it was further proof that America was at war with them, even if it wouldn't say it out loud. By 1988, both Iran and Iraq were exhausted. Over 1 million people were dead. Entire cities were flattened. Both economies were in ruins. Iran agreed to a UN-brokered ceasefire, not out of defeat, but survival. Ayatollah Khomeini said accepting the ceasefire was like drinking a cup of poison. And though Iraq had started the war, Iran was now more isolated than ever. The United States had succeeded in containing the revolution at a horrific cost. Just 2 years later, Saddam Hussein would invade Kuwait, triggering the Gulf War and turning Saddam into America's new enemy. The US would bomb him in 1991 and again in 2003. But in the eyes of Iran, the damage had already been done. The US had overthrown their democratic leader, 1953, supported a brutal monarch, 1953 to 1979, armed their enemy with intelligence and support, 1980 to 88, and stood by during chemical massacres and civilian deaths. To Iran, this wasn't strategy. It was a declaration of eternal hostility. The war with Iraq had ended. The blood had dried. The guns had quieted. But the hostility between Iran and the United States was far from over. In fact, it was just entering its most dangerous phase. A quiet, invisible standoff that revolved around a single word: nuclear. Iran's nuclear program began in the 1950s with American help. Under the US-backed Atoms for Peace program, Iran was provided with its first nuclear reactor during the Shah's reign. In 1974, Iran even signed contracts with American companies to build 20 nuclear power plants. But after the revolution of 1979, everything changed. The US withdrew its support. The nuclear cooperation was cancelled. Yet, Iran's ambitions didn't die. Over the following decades, Iran quietly revived its nuclear infrastructure, with help from Russia, China, and Pakistan's Ekukan network. Iran insisted, "We are enriching uranium for energy and medicine, not bombs." But the West didn't believe it, especially Israel, and especially the United States. By the early 2000s, the US and Israel had made up their minds. Iran was secretly building a nuclear weapon. The response? A new kind of warfare. Covert, digital, and deadly. Iranian nuclear scientists began mysteriously dying, gunned down in broad daylight. Explosions rocked nuclear facilities. In 2010, a new weapon appeared: Stuxnet, a computer virus created by the US and Israel. It infected Iranian centrifuges, causing them to self-destruct from the inside, without a single bullet fired. This was cyber warfare, unprecedented and deniable, and it worked for a while. But each attack only hardened Iran's resolve. They rebuilt, they fortified, and they moved their program deeper underground. While the covert war raged behind the scenes, the US launched a global campaign of economic isolation. Iran was cut off from the SWIFT banking system. Its oil exports were crippled. Foreign companies were threatened with secondary sanctions. The Iranian rial collapsed and inflation soared. For ordinary Iranians, life became unbearable. Prices of medicine skyrocketed. Jobs vanished. Families stood in line for hours to buy basic goods. To Washington, this was maximum pressure. To Tehran, it was economic terrorism. And the nuclear standoff continued, spiraling ever closer to war. Then, in 2015, something unexpected happened. After years of secret talks, the Obama administration, along with the UK, Russia, China, France, and Germany, signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, better known as the Iran Nuclear Deal. The terms: Iran would limit its uranium enrichment, cut back on centrifuges, and allow unprecedented inspections. In return, the West would lift sanctions and unlock billions in frozen assets. It was a gamble and a diplomatic triumph. Obama said, "This deal is not built on trust. It is built on verification." And for a moment, the temperature dropped. Planes flew. Embassies reconnected. There was even talk of a new chapter. But the peace was fragile. President Donald Trump did what Iran feared most. He unilaterally withdrew from the nuclear deal, despite Iran's compliance. His administration reimposed brutal sanctions, targeting Iran's economy harder than ever before. Oil exports fell to record lows. The rial collapsed further. US-Iran relations were shattered. Again, Tehran responded by resuming uranium enrichment. The nuclear clock began ticking once more. The Trump era brought back not just sanctions, but assassinations. In 2020, Qasem Soleimani, Iran's most powerful military commander, was killed in a US drone strike in Baghdad. That same year, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the father of Iran's nuclear program, was assassinated near Tehran, allegedly by Israeli operatives using remote-controlled AI gun tech. These were not just symbolic kills. They were acts of war, quiet, precise, and provocative. Iran vowed revenge, but it also played the long game, knowing that history often bends not through violence, but patience. Still looks today, Iran is closer to weapons-grade enrichment than ever before. It spins advanced centrifuges underground. It has stockpiles far exceeding deal limits. And it has no deal to hold it back. Yet, Tehran still claims, "We do not want nuclear weapons. We want respect. We want sovereignty." For decades, the US and Iran have rarely fought directly. Their war isn't like those in history books. No tanks charging each other across a border. Instead, it's fought through others, by militias, airstrikes, and political influence across the Middle East. It's a war without a clear battlefield, and without end. What is a proxy war? A proxy war happens when two powerful nations fight through third parties, arming, funding, or directing allies to battle on their behalf. For the US and Iran, this strategy became essential after the fall of the Shah, when direct confrontation became too risky. Instead of sending their own troops, they send weapons, money, ideology, and chaos. The first major proxy battlefield emerged in Lebanon in the 1980s. Israel had invaded. A civil war raged, and in the middle of the storm, Iran backed a new Shia militant group, Hezbollah. Hezbollah was trained by Iran's Revolutionary Guard. It soon became a political party, a paramilitary force, and a symbol of Iranian influence beyond its borders. Hezbollah bombed US Marine barracks in 1983, killing 241 Americans, and it became the blueprint for Iran's future strategy: empower local militias, undermine American allies, expand influence. When Syria's civil war exploded in 2011, it became a multi-nation nightmare. President Bashar al-Assad, a longtime Iranian ally, faced collapse. Iran stepped in massively. It sent money, weapons, and military advisors. It deployed Hezbollah fighters to defend Assad. It used the war to expand a Shia crescent of power, from Iran through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. The US, meanwhile, supported moderate rebel groups, trying to force Assad out. At times, US-backed forces and Iranian-backed militias fought on opposite sides of the same Syrian city. It was a proxy war, layered into a civil war, wrapped in a global power struggle. In Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the Arab world, another proxy war ignited. Iran supported the Houthi rebels, a Shia group that overthrew Yemen's US-backed government. Saudi Arabia, Iran's regional rival and a close US ally, responded with a devastating air campaign, backed by American weapons and logistics. The result? Over 377,000 dead, mostly from famine, disease, and airstrikes. Entire cities reduced to rubble. US bombs, killing civilians at weddings, funerals, and school buses, used by Saudi jets. Iran's involvement was minimal in scale, but massive in impact, because it turned Yemen into a choke point in the US-Iran Cold War. After the US toppled Saddam Hussein in 2003, it inadvertently opened the door for Iran. Iraq's new Shia-led government welcomed Iranian influence. Pro-Iran militias like Kataib Hezbollah emerged. US troops faced constant ambushes by Iranian-trained fighters. Iran used Iraq as a bridge, linking Tehran to Syria and Lebanon. By the 2010s, Iraq had become a strategic base in Iran's regional plan, and a nightmare for US presence. War at the center of Iran's proxy empire stood Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds Force, the elite wingers of the Revolutionary Guard. He coordinated militias in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza. He moved like a ghost, appearing in war zones, disappearing just as fast. To Iran, he was a national hero. To the US, he was public enemy number one. That's why, in January 2020, the US assassinated him with a drone strike near Baghdad airport, without warning and without apology. Iran responded by launching missiles at US bases in Iraq, injuring over 100 soldiers. And once again, the war in the shadows threatened to become a war in the open. Why proxy wars matter to the outside world? It might look like random chaos, but these are chess moves. Iran uses proxy wars to surround Israel, keep the US distracted, and project power without risking full-scale war. The US uses its alliances to counter Iran's reach, protect oil routes, and preserve dominance in the region. Each missile, each airstrike, each militia is part of a bigger game. A game where no one wins and millions suffer. The fuse has been lit. For nearly half a century, the United States and Iran have been locked in a bitter rivalry, one born of coups, oil, revolution, and blood. But in June 2025, the Cold War went hot, and the world watched the fuse ignite.